All right, my friends, it's time to talk about everyone's favorite topic, public versus private schools. So as a person that went to private school, I had it in my head when I was growing up that the ratio of people going to public versus private school was probably something like 33-66 or 40-60, something like that, with, of course, the majority going to public and about a third or so of people going to private school. Being in my late 20s, I started hearing different things, which is that the majority of people go to public school, like the overwhelming majority. And so I started looking into this, and lo and behold, I found that only about 10% of people go to private schools, and the rest of the 90% of people are stuck with the public school system. Of course, that doesn't mean that all public schools are dog shit, but public schools get a bad rap for a reason, and we'll go into those later on. Anyway, it's not like my reality was shattered, but yeah, it seems that the overwhelming majority of people go to public schools, and then that gets you thinking, because I also realized this as someone who works in the real world with the general public now, some of these guys really did not have a good schooling, or at least it was extremely lackluster. When you have a job and you're dealing with the general public, you start picking up on things, especially if you're someone who went to private school, like, man, some of these people really are not getting it, you know? And these are adults. So something I also learned is that private schools are way more abundant in urban areas and suburban areas compared to the rural areas, which are like 4 times less likely to actually have private schools in comparison to their public schools, right? So now we get to do everyone's favorite part, the most controversial part. Looking at everyone's race and ethnicity and the school level racial composition. So of course we never know with these sources what ChatGPT is choosing, which ones it's handpicking and which ones it's not, even if it does cite the source over here. But the private school student poverty rate is 11% and the public school student poverty rate is 17%. So if this is right, it's saying that for every 2 students in poverty in private school, 3 are in poverty in public school. In private schools, 70% majority is white, 14% is no majority, and 7% is black and 6 Hispanic, with blacks and Hispanics seriously lagging behind, right? So private schools tend to be extremely white. And judging by what we can over here, we see whiteness, right? In public schools, 54% of the majority is white, and the charters are more diverse. And on the NAEP, it seems that private school students outperform public counterparts at grades 4, 12, and 8. How specific is that and how much more? I couldn't really tell you, other than just taking it from my favorite scapegoat, ChatGPT. So urban and rural patterns. Speak of large diversity in cities, rural have poorer outcomes and fewer resources. Urban districts have seen declining enrollment. So the public schools in urban areas, right? 30% of public students are diverse, more charters, but strong but in uneven outcomes, right? And that's to say that not all public schools are dog shit, but where you live heavily depends on how good the local school will actually be. In private schools, 43% are in cities and generally high performing with lower poverty rates. Go figure, if you have extra money to spend and invest in your child, you will do it if you can and put them into a private school and avoid them from seeing the dysfunction and the crap that you have to deal with in public school, right? So the suburban public schools are 39% and often majority white, well-resourced, and that typically seems to be the case. In private suburban schools, they have strong outcomes and similar demographics to urban private. In rural, there's a higher poverty, lower scores, and declining enrollment. Private schools have less common but tend to be small and high-performing. So the major takeaways about public and private school, at least on the surface: public schools serve the vast majority, private schools serve a niche market skewed towards urban, suburban, higher income families. Private schools have lower poverty levels and less racial ethnic diversity, while public schools, especially chartered, are more diverse and serve more low-income students. Academic outcomes: private school students consistently score higher on standardized assessments in the US and abroad. Public school performance varies significantly between urban and rural settings. Urban versus rural. Journeys diverge. Urban offers choices and research-rich schools. Rural public schools face funding challenges, and there are fewer private options. So one of the main reasons I'm kind of having this revelation and want to talk to you guys about it is because when you have a job and you deal with the general public, especially as someone who went to private school, you kind of have that thought that, oh, you know, the public's got this private school standard and they're all being semi-rational. That's not the case. When you start dealing with people in the public, you start thinking like, what the fuck is this, right? These people are like, some of these people are just like total animals, right? Behavior-wise, maybe you go to an Astros game or a Rangers game or even a Dodgers game, and you start to see these people in the crowds, and you start to think like, this is not the behavior I grew up with, right? This is like, there's a lot of outrageous and unacceptable stuff, right? Of course, the majority of people are fine, or at least semi-reasonable, but there are definitely some people out there who you're just like, oh my god, right? I asked ChatGPT how terrible public schools are generally in comparison with private schools. And it's right, public schools are not inherently terrible, but compared to private schools, they face some serious, real disadvantages that can impact outcomes. And this is a trend I want to highlight with you guys about academic performance, right? And it says with standardized tests, on average, private school students score higher on SAT, ACT, and NEEP, as it previously mentioned at grades 4, 8, and 12. College readiness. Private school grads are more likely to complete AP courses, apply to college, and graduate college. This is an important note, and this is the trend that I want to talk to you about. However, when controlling for student income, parental education, and school funding, the achievement gap shrinks and disappears in some cases. That means the average private school advantage often reflects who attends them more than how they teach, and that's 100% true. When you have parents who are generally married, because we'll get into this later, but parents who send their kids to private school are generally married more on average. And in turn, when you have a husband and wife, they're going to raise their kids a lot better than a single mom or single dad will, right? And so when you've invested all these resources and given the child a mom and dad to work with, the child is more likely to just be smart by nature of that happening rather than them going to private school and that enhancing and fine-tuning what they would learn otherwise in a public school, right? So the point is, when you put all this time and investment into your children, way more off the books, right, and outside the school, what the return you're going to see is not necessarily testable, even though that'll be a side benefit, right? They'll just have like a higher IQ and just be like a more high-functioning person that can be successful later on in life, right? So class sizes in public schools are often 16 to 20 students per class. I don't know how true this is. I've heard a lot of variance in terms of that. Private schools are often 10 to 15 and more individual attention. This might be doing it on a national average, and I don't know how that skews it, right? Facilities and programs. Private schools generally have more funding per student, especially elite ones. Yeah, makes sense. Better extracurriculars, arts, athletics, foreign languages, and newer facilities. However, some well-funded public schools, especially suburban ones, rival or exceed private schools in quality. And that makes sense, right? Like I told you guys, when you have a house that's worth 500 grand and a house that's worth 100 grand, and let's just say the tax rate is flat at 10% for income or for rather property taxes, if you take 10% from both, $10,000 from 100,000 and 50,000 from 500,000, which school is getting more money? This one's getting 5 times as much more, even though the tax rate is still the same, right? So when you invest that into the school, of course it's going to have more money, right? Safety and discipline. Students and parents often perceive private schools as safer with more structure and stricter discipline. Fewer incidents of violence, drug use, or gang presence reported, right? So in the private school that I went to, there's obviously no gangs, but why would that be the case? Is it because it's natural for kids to make gangs and use drugs and allow incidents of violence, or are the parents who are sending them to private schools already have invested so much in those children that those behaviors and activities are just not even a thought to the children because they grew up with the structure that told them no? Whereas, of course, the majority of parents don't actually allow for that, but the ones that slip through the cracks are going to be exposed to that and bleed through the school system and be a parent, because those public schools take those types of people who are maybe a little bit more low income and also have other problems at home and also have children that deal with dysfunctional problems at home, right? Whereas in private school, that's not going to happen nearly as much, right? Because the parents are able to afford it. So urban public schools are very mixed. Some are elite, like magnet schools. Others are underfunded, crowded, and deal with extreme poverty and violence. There's a huge variance in that, right? Rural public schools are often severely underfunded, lower scores, fewer AP/IB classes, and less access to counselors or specialists. Meanwhile, urban and suburban private schools are well-resourced, serve wealthier and more academically prepared students, and can choose who they want to admit, right? Public schools can't, and that is one of the biggest differences between them, right? A private school who's looking at like a child, right? Does this child show some sort of like gang-like behavior? Does he seem to show preponderance to violence? Private schools are going to be very good at screening out who does and who doesn't do that, right? So therefore, by just admitting the people who are not prone to violence, they save themselves not only a lot of headache, but they stop other children from being exposed to that because it's not allowed in the school place there, right? Meanwhile, public schools have to take whoever's in the local area. It's very rare that they can kick people out. So go figure, there's going to be huge admittance of the general public, and you're going to have a lot of dysfunction that comes with that, right? Teacher quality. Public school teachers are more likely to be certified and unionized. Private school teachers may have more flexibility, but are often paid less and don't always have formal credentials. Man, it's kind of wild that you could be in a private school and not be paid as much. So how terrible are public schools? Public schools' academic scores are lower on average and very variable. Private schools are higher average, especially at elite schools. Class size larger, private schools are smaller. Funding is uneven, often limited by local taxes. Private schools' funding is higher and tuition-driven, of course, because you're not pointing a gun at people to take it from them. They are voluntarily giving their money away to a place where they believe in that institution, right? Safety, it varies greatly and can be really rough sometimes. Private schools are generally safer and more controlled, of course. Teachers are more likely to be certified in public, and the private are less likely, but sometimes more flexible. The access to public schools is uneven depending on district in terms of like AP, arts, and I guess all these secondary things. And private schools are broad offerings in most cases. Don't really know a whole lot about these. So public schools are not uniformly bad, but they are extremely inconsistent and disadvantaged compared to private schools in many other ways, especially in the high poverty areas. The worst public schools, often in large cities or rural regions, can be genuinely failing students, while the best are competitive with elite private institutions. The system is less about public versus private and more about which zip code and which families are involved. That is the beauty of the private school system right there. When you are in a public school, you are beholden to the zip code you are in. You do not get to choose who you are with, right? If you can only afford a certain area, you are going to school with that area's kids, whether you like it or not, for the most part, as far as I understand, right? You don't get to handpick which families are involved, whose dysfunction is going to school, right? Whereas with private schools, you could say, you know what, I'm opting out of this. I'm getting fucked by public property taxes anyway, but I would rather put my child in a situation where they are going to have friends and they're going to be exposed to only families that are way more functional on average, right? Two-parent households, healthy enough income to be supporting it, to where it's not an arm and a leg and it's not going to put them in financial poverty and destitution. You get to handpick who your children are exposed to. That is so fucking important, because guess what? If you have your kind of average person, right, who's in the private school system, they don't see that gang and drug shit, right, that you would see in some of the more poverty-stricken areas and poverty-stricken zip codes, right? When you have that same kid who's kind of average, not really thinking a whole lot about this stuff and wasn't exposed to it in their household because they have a functional household, but they go to that public school, they're going to be exposed to that stuff and could be more likely to get involved. Not always, but just by being exposed to it, it's very different than just never seeing it when you're in the private school system. Of course, this is mostly on average. There's going to be both sides in each one. But generally, the private school system is going to be much cleaner and not going to have nearly as much dysfunction. And in turn, because people are choosing private schools and have to pay tuition, rather than a gun just being pointed at them and saying, fuck you, give me your property taxes, private schools have to deliver, otherwise they lose out on parents and their tuition. Public schools, you don't have that option. You can't really opt out. The best opting out you can do is like what? Homeschooling? And then you still have to pay for the public schools. It's fucking dog shit. So very quickly, we'll go over the next thing I asked, which is the pros and cons of private versus public school. Here's a clear and honest breakdown. So overall, the pros of public school are it's free, right? Free. There's no such thing as free. It's free because there's no tuition, but you're paying shitloads in property taxes. So more or less, you're paying on it, right? It's funded by local, state, and federal taxes. ChatGPT has a great way of giving you the half-truth, right? It's diverse. It's often more racial, cultural, and socioeconomic diversity. So diversity is a really funny way of putting it like this, right? But racial diversity and socioeconomic diversity are like two things I'll touch on here, right? When you have diversity and it's racial, okay, well, we're exposed to more Hispanics and more blacks, whereas the private school majority is white, as we saw, right? Do we really give a shit what color people are? Like, if you have smart people and they're Mexican or Latino, that's great. If you have smart people and they're black, that's great. If you have smart people and they're white, then that's great. Who cares what they look like? If they're smart and able to contribute to society and solve other people's problems, regardless of what they look like, who gives a fuck? I don't care about diversity. I care about someone who can get the job done, right? Do we really care about who's flying the airplane as long as the person can get it done? I don't really give a shit. You could have 15 black pilots, and as long as they're better than the white pilots, I don't care. I'm going to hire them, right? I do not want my plane flying into a fucking building or flying into the ocean because we decided to hire people that are not fit for the job, right? And there's the racial diversity rant of the day. Now let's talk about the socioeconomic diversity, right? You have some rich people, you have a lot more middle class people, and you have way more poor people probably in the public school, or the people who are a little faltering on their economics, right? Do you really want that kind of diversity? I suppose it helps your child see, oh, there's people that are different than me, right? But do you really want that? Is that something you want? Like, is this, when you're thinking about your schools, are you thinking like, nope, now there has to be an equal amount of rich people, poor people, and middle class people in the same thing, otherwise I will not go. It would be a ridiculous thing for my child to be exposed to all this, right? No, you want to go to the school that is going to give you the best result. You don't really care about the economic status of the people that are around you, generally, right? Okay, and the access to special services, legally required to provide services, IEPs, ESL, DS, disability accommodations. Or I guess that's not provided as much in the private school system, but I'm pretty sure that private schools will be more than happy to accommodate for whoever goes there, right? As long as they're behaviorally okay, and they can keep up with the rest of the class, roughly, right? Public school, okay, this is one that I actually think is not bad, right? If you go to public school and it's community-based, your kids go to school with neighbors and integrate it into the local area. That's pretty reasonable, right? You want to have a community and you want to know your community, and if your kids go to school with neighbors, that's like about as good as it's going to get, right? When it comes to private school, you throw all that out the window, and now you're going to school sometimes with people who live across the city, right? I was going to school on the opposite side of town, and it was with all these sorts of people who lived on the other side of town, right? So if this is where I go to school and this is where I live, I was going to school with people who live over here, right? That means I was going to school with friends who I almost never saw or had opportunity to see because they live so far away from me, right? And that was a little frustrating. But again, I didn't have tons of friends in high school, you know? Certified teachers more likely to have state certification and advanced degrees. I'm not really sure if I think that it's the end-all be-all that a teacher has to have a state certification or advanced degree, to be honest. Like, oh boy, this guy's a nuclear physicist, so we have to have him teach, right? It doesn't hurt, but, you know, sometimes do you want a nuclear physicist teaching 6-year-olds? Like, you just have to give them someone who's going to be well adjusted to their age group and can get them along in the stage of life they're in, right? Large variety of extracurriculars. Many offer sports, music, theater at scale in public school. That's awesome. You should have sports everywhere. I'm going to make a video about this at some point, but I would much rather play sports than go fucking lift weights. I can't stand lifting weights. And these are all good activities. You should be getting your kid involved in other extracurricular activities. When you have a kid and he finds other kids that like doing what he likes to do, he's going to have friends right there, you know? The AP, IB, and magnet programs are strong options in many districts for gifted or focused learning. Okay. Don't really know much about this. I just know there were a few AP classes in the high school I went to. The cons. Quality varies by zip code. Rich districts equal strong schools, as we discussed. Poor districts are underfunded and struggling. Yep. Overcrowding. Larger class sizes and limited resources. Seems to be the case. Limited control discipline. This is a huge con for public schools, right? They have to admit and serve all students, including the disruptive ones and the ones that come from the dysfunctional families where that behavior is tolerated, right? What do you think that does for the class? Does that speed up the class or does that slow the class down, right? That means that those kids who are behaving and come from decent families where they know how to behave are actually at loss because they have to wait for the other kids who are dragging the speed of the class down. That is fucking brutal, right? Bureaucracy is tied to district and state policies and limited flexibility. Fucking brutal. You have to deal with all these bureaucratic shitheads. As we all know, bureaucracy sucks. Safety concerns are there's more issues in urban or high school poverty schools. Of course, this is what the media kind of says, right? So I don't have personal experience with this too much. So the media has you believe that people are like, you know, bringing guns to school and shit. And it's not like they don't, but, you know, they have like metal detectors in like some of these like high schools and grade schools and shit. And that shit's just like wild, right? And it could be a problem in certain areas, right? But this was not an issue in private schools, right? And what the hell if you're the average schmuck who's got a good like behaving kid, right? And they're exposed to crap like this, like, oh yeah, we have to go through the metal detector at school. Like, are you fucking kidding me? So now we get to go to the pros and cons of the private schools: smaller class sizes, more individualized attention, closer student-teacher relationships. Of course, that's the case. And also, I would emphasize not only closer student-teacher relationships, I would say closer parent-teacher relationships, right? The parent is monitoring and helicoptering the kid a little bit more and seeing what they're learning. And then in public school, where they kind of just say, wow, what the hell with the cookie cutter crap, the parents and teachers are going to be actively talking to each other way more. And also the parents in private schools talk to each other probably way more, right? Don't forget, when you have like a community and you're all kind of going towards the same thing, it's like, oh man, you're in the private school too. You avoided the public school disaster. Okay, let's talk about this together because we both know our child is trying to get to a higher place in life, right? Or at least we're trying to avoid them being exposed to all the dog shit in the public schools, right? Strong academics, often higher tests in college placement rates, as we've discussed. Safer environment, often stricter discipline, and lower rates of violence and bullying. Compared to public school, I would totally agree with that. Values-based education can align with religious and philosophical beliefs: Catholic, Christian, Jewish, Montessori. Yeah, the separation of church and state is not a thing in those schools. More curriculum flexibility, not bound by state testing or curriculum mandates. More parental involvement, stronger community feel, more responsive administration. I already touched on the community feel, but the more responsive administration, because they know that they're adhering to parents who are paying them based on them delivering results, they know that they have to respond to stuff, whereas public schools are just like, you know, who gives a fuck, right? Elite networks, in some cases, access to prestigious alumni and social capital, which I guess could be the case. I don't think it was the case in my private school, though, right? The cons, the tuition can range from $5,000 to $50,000 a year, not accessible to everyone. I think this $50,000 talking about those elite schools that we saw at the beginning. There's no way that this is like the average now, right? We'll talk about more about the demographics and how much money these tuition costs actually compared to a few years ago, right? Lack of oversight, less regulated, teachers don't always need certifications. Lack of oversight, is this really a con or a pro, right? Less diversity, often more racially, economically, and ideologically homogenous. Again, is this really a con? Do we really care about how many types of people show up into which school? Not really. Just give me the best ideas and give me the product to be delivered, you know? I don't care who makes it. Limited services may not offer support for special needs or disabilities. Well, I wonder how many of these private schools are actually admitting kids with special needs or disabilities in the first place, like severe, significant, like hindering ones, you know? Selective admissions can reject students based on academics, behavior, and background. Again, is this a con? Not college guaranteed. Is public this way? Prestige doesn't guarantee success. Some public schools outperform private. Of course, that's the case, but on average, that's not going to be so much, right? I feel like 4 of these cons were actually like pros, right? When private's better, your child needs more structure or academic challenge. You're seeking a values-based or religious education. You can afford it without financial hardship. That's probably the best one. Public schools nearby are unsafe or underperforming. I would say these 2 are way more important than the other 2, right? Like, if you're exposed to the public, man, you want to if you can pay to keep your kid away from the public shit and the just degeneracy that you can see on day-to-day basis, I would say just pay for private, right? It keeps your kid in a safe environment. When public is better, you want your child exposed to real-world diversity. Do we care? You value certified teachers and inclusive supportive services. Nah. You're in a strong school district. Many suburban ones outperform average private schools. Okay, yeah, that's very reasonable. In Texas, I know this is definitely the case, right? A lot of people will talk about the school systems in certain areas, for example, like Katy, Texas. You also have some really good ones in McKinney and Dallas over there. Like, I've heard a lot of people rave about how good those two school systems can be, you know? And go figure, those are the nicer areas, right, of the two major cities. You can't justify the cost difference, especially if your child is self-motivated. I think if you can just do private school anyway, even if it's an arm and a leg, you should still do it just to prevent, unless like this says you're in a really good area, kind of like Katy or McKinney, where the public schools are just going to be really good because those areas are really wealthy and they're going to be decent, right? You'll have enough decent other families where you don't have to worry about the shithead factor that you would deal with in like public schools, you know? Private schools offer a more polished, controlled experience, but at a price. Public schools are more varied, sometimes chaotic, but reflect the real world and can be excellent depending on the location and leadership. I would agree with that totally. It can be really chaotic, but it reflects the real world. Do you want the real world? Not always. You want to be in your kind of nice niche little bubble, and you want to keep your kid in a safer environment where they won't be exposed to all that real world dog shit, right? So something I do sometimes just to get the ball rolling is I'll ask ChatGPT to actually just help me brainstorm and make a video. It usually gives you these kind of cookie cutter generic scripts, but it does throw some good ideas in there sometimes, right? And I'll just go over the highlights I thought I saw from this. So I just wanted to add this point. Public schools tied to zip codes and local property tax is inherent with inequality baked in. I didn't inherently say that, but this is the case. There's always fucking inequality with this, right? And inequality is a good thing, right? If we were all equal in the exact same, life would be terrible, right? So then I wanted to ask ChatGPT how many of the parents of public school kids are doing drugs versus private, just to kind of be a little edgy, right? And while it says there's no direct data set of how many parents in public schools kids are doing drugs versus private school kids, we can infer meaningful trends using demographic, socioeconomic data, and national substance use surveys. Here's a breakdown. Private school families. Higher income, higher parental education, more likely to be married. Public school families span wider, but are higher proportions of low income, single parent, and lower education households, especially in urban and rural schools. According to a national survey on drug use and health, drug use is highest among adults who are 18 to 25, unemployed, and have low educational attainment and live below the poverty line. So public school parents will be more likely to fit into that bracket than private school parents, right? So substance abuse is more prevalent among the average public school parent, especially in low income districts. Private school parents, being wealthier and more educated on average, tend to have a lower drug abuse rate, though they may drink socially more often, even if they're not abusing the alcohol. So let's look at the marital status of private and public schools. Parents of private schools are more likely to be college educated, as we discussed. Marriage rates by education level. 89% of parents with a college degree are married. 64% of parents with less than a high school diploma or 70% of high school diploma holder versus 64% of parents with less than a high school diploma. Go figure. Since private school families are more highly educated, their marriage rates are correspondingly higher. Public school alumni had the highest rates of non-marital childbirth at 26%, compared to just 11% Protestant and secular private school alumni. 26% is fucking insane. Public school alumni had the highest rates of non-marital childbirth at 26%. 1 in 4 people being born in that public school system are fucking gonna be unmarried. That is insane, right? And when it says public school alumni, that means public school parent, which means in 5 years, their child will be ready to go to public school. So don't let it kind of fool you that way, right? A public school alumni person is going to be a parent and also going to put that child in public school, right? Generally. Private school parents are likely to have higher marriage rates, reflecting their highest education level and family status stability context. Public school parents have show more variation and lower marriage rates among less educated and lower income groups. And of course, they'll be more financially stable. And that's a good way to put it, right? That just because you go to private school doesn't mean you're rich. We certainly weren't, right? It just means that you were financially stable enough to do it, right? And as you can see, 85 to 90% of parents are married in the private school system, and public school are 60 to 70%. The difference is 15 to 25%, which is a pretty big number, right? And it's kind of going through a lot of this stuff. So I told it to, with all these misspellings, give me a polished version of what I typed, right? Students in private schools are less likely to be exposed to classmates with highly disruptive or destructive behavior, often the kind that stems from unstable or dysfunctional home environments. In public schools where the admission is mandatory and based on geography rather than fit, students are more likely to encounter peers dealing with unresolved trauma, neglect, or lack of discipline at home, and it totally carries over, right? In contrast, private schools have more control over who they admit and keep enrolled. They can screen for behavior, academic readiness, and even family involvement, which is a huge part, by the way, right? This naturally results in a more stable, structured environment where good behavior is the norm and not the exception. As a result, students in the private schools are less likely to be influenced by negative peer behavior, less likely to see behavior modeled daily, and therefore it is less likely to engage it in themselves, 100%. They're surrounded by peers whose family, on average, place a high value on discipline, respect, and academic achievement. This creates a positive feedback loop. Better behavior is both expected and reinforced, making it easier for students to stay on the right path. And of course, we know that children are shaped heavily by their peer group. If your peer group's not destructive, it's a W, right? A private school education isn't just about better books or buildings, it's about being immersed in a healthier social environment, where the behavior baseline is higher and the negative peer influences are far less common. That difference in daily exposure shapes how students learn, behave, and grow over time. Yep. Alright, we're getting kind of to the end here. Okay, the last point that I want to touch on for the video is, let's look at the private school enrollment in the last 25 years or so, in increments of 5 years minus COVID, and see how that works. In 2000 and 2005 it was roughly the same number. In 2010 it went down significantly. Of course, that's right after the recession. In 2015 it went back up. 2021 is very skewed because we know that COVID messed with that 2 or 3 year period there heavily. So enrollment stable, noticeable decline, probably from the Great Recession, a rebound, and gradual decline, right? Some of the trends that we can look at is that tuition has roughly doubled in nominal terms from 2000 to 2025. Median household income fell behind tuition growth, absolutely, leading to tuition eating up a significant larger portion of family budgets by the mid-2010s. That is the key point here, right? When you look at the decline of private schools, and it's not been a huge decline, but when people are choosing between things, things are getting tighter and tighter, and you're not able to have that flexibility that you did before, because guess what? Inflation has been dog shit in the last 25 years. Is it going to get better? No. Are private schools going to keep growing? Absolutely not. They're going to keep getting more expensive, and people are going to be making less money, at least in terms of buying power, right? Geographic differences matter. In metro areas like New York and LA, tuition regularly approaches or exceeds 50% of median income, which is fucking insane. Religious or private schools typically cost less, often, e.g. Catholic, often under 10% of income compared to the independent day school. In 2000, private was significant but manageable, 15%, right? By 2010, that burden had surged to nearly half of income, which is fucking insane, right? As of 2025, tuition still represents a substantial financial commitment for middle-income families, of course, often a quarter or a fifth of household income through financial aid programs to help offset it. That's still a huge chunk, right? So if you go from 15% to 20 or 25%, that's another 5% that you're not working with in your income, right? If you're making $100,000 a year, let's just throw 5% in there. That's $5,000 or $10,000 that you're not working with anymore, right? And that's assuming you're lucky enough to be making $100K, which doesn't even buy that much anymore, right? $100K today is like $50,000 30 years ago. Yep, and private schooling is a major investment and significantly more demanding than it was for families two decades ago.